Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, my guest is Tracy Pearl. She's a law professor at Texas Tech University Law School. I'm going to tell you the name of the article she wrote just recently that we're talking about. I think that's all I need to say. Her article is called Hands Off the Wheel, The Role of Law in the Coming Extinction of Human-Driven Vehicles. So you see, you want to listen to this episode. Fascinating stuff. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on today's episode is Tracy Pearl, who is a professor of law at Texas Tech University Law School and the author of a new article called Hands Off the Wheel, The Role of Law in the Coming Extinction of Human-Driven Vehicles. Such a captivating, intriguing title, and we're going to talk all about self-driving automobiles and the law today. Tracy, first of all, thank you so much for being on the program. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us, before we get into this topic, and as we were getting started, I confessed to you that until I read this article, I knew very little about this subject other than what probably lots of people think when they think about self-driving vehicles, which is, oh my God, this sounds so scary. But it's actually a lot less scary once you understand it better, and so I hope our listeners will appreciate that too. But tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got so interested in this topic.
Sure. So I have been a law professor for the last 7 years, and my area of focus in my research is law and technology, and in particular, driverless cars, because I think they're so fascinating from a legal perspective, but also from a societal perspective as well. On the teaching side, I teach both tort and criminal law, both of which are implicated by so many of the new technologies that we have emerging in our society. And I'm also now, as of 2 years ago, the owner of a semi-self-driving car. My husband and I purchased a Tesla Model X with the autopilot system 2 years ago. And so, I've had to make this transition in my own life, which has also been a point of information for me in my own work. So it's a great area to research. I wish there were more law professors and more attorneys working in this space because we've got a lot of work to do in the coming decade.
Well, that's a great intro for this topic. And as I mentioned, this is an area I knew very little about. In fact, I didn't even know that I drive a level 1 self-driving vehicle because my car has cruise control. But we'll get into that.
Right. Right.
We'll get into that a little bit. But maybe as a way to launch us into this topic, you could tell us about 2 stories involving very closely related, but not related as closely in time, 2 stories involving citizens who got very angry about some new technology that they were confronting. And in both cases, there was some rock throwing involved. So I thought you could start off by telling us those 2 stories, and that'll help us.
Right. So for the past year, I've been doing a lot of research about the transition between horses and human-driven vehicles that took place about 100 years ago. I realized about a year ago that really no lawyers had investigated that at any length and tried to figure out what, if anything, we could learn from that transitional period that we had right at the turn of the 20th century, from the 19th to the 20th century. And one of the stories that I came across that really stuck with me was a story about the reaction that citizens had to vehicles when they first appeared on the market, which was really around 1895. So all of a sudden, there's all of these new vehicles on the road. And people hate them largely. People are really scared of them. People think they're really dangerous. They're driving at a blistering pace of 12 miles per hour, some of them. And there's a lot of concern at the time that humans cannot physically withstand that kind of speed. Some doctors actually warned that women would have their uteruses fall out of their body if they traveled at 12 miles an hour. And worse, these cars tended to scare the horses that were still on the road in large numbers. And so there was this backlash around 1896, 1897, where all throughout the country, citizens started throwing rocks at the motor vehicles on their street. And in fact, in the country, in many areas, farmers start doing things like stretching barbed wire across the country lanes to prohibit or to stop motor vehicles from traveling them. And it gets so bad in New York City at one point that the New York New York City Police Department, has to deploy police officers to stand and essentially guard the motor vehicles that are driving down the main thoroughfares in Manhattan. And so I read these stories, and they're kind of funny now in retrospect. People just seem to be really overreacting to a technology that, in hindsight, we know is going to be great for society. But then I came across a much more recent story from last year, where citizens in Tempe, Arizona, actually took to the streets and threw rocks at the self-driving cars that were being tested in that area. And that was largely in response to a pretty well-publicized accident involving one of those motor vehicles hitting and killing a pedestrian. It made citizens very angry. It seemed to confirm these beliefs that people have right now, that self-driving cars will never be as safe as human-driven cars, and that they represent a danger to everybody on the road. And so it's really sort of deja vu all over again. It's almost exactly 100 years later, slightly more than 100 years, but citizens are still having that sort of same scared response, leading to violence against these new forms of technology.
Well, and there have been throughout history, and we'll get into the issue of situations where we, through the law, through some regulation at the state or federal level, actually ban a product because it's so dangerous. There have been those moments in history, but this isn't just any ordinary new technology that people don't like or they're afraid of because they don't understand it or whatever the reasons might be. These are, in both cases, really transformational new technologies. And I think you need to say something about that, because that's really at the heart of what we're facing right now. And I was really impressed with going back and looking at how people reacted to the transformational change that the automobile brought, because you're right, we take it for granted now. And it may seem quaint now to look back and think that people were afraid of what could happen driving at speeds of 12 miles per hour. We now, we're a country of NASCAR fans, and 12 miles per hour would be, it's nothing. But talk a little bit about that, because I think that gets us into also why the law is going to be so important, or I think, as you're going to argue, why we should be looking to other sources for change and regulation besides the law. But that's for a few minutes down the road, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, so, I think there's a pattern that you see historically when you see one of these transformative new technologies, and that's that people will react with great fear and skepticism, right? And there's sort of a spectrum. There's sort of the early adopters who think it's amazing and they want to be the first ones to own it in their neighborhood. And then there's always sort of the Luddites who, even 40 years later are still saying, I refuse to drive a motor vehicle. I'm always going to have my horse. I think with driverless cars, one way that I started talking about them with people who are not researchers in this space is I started framing self-driving cars as really a public health issue, right? Motor vehicle crashes are a leading cause of death in our country for a number of age ranges. And they injure so many more people a year. There's millions and millions of accidents every year that injure millions of people. It's incredibly costly. And right now, the conservative projection is that self-driving cars, once they reach a level 5, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment, but that's sort of a fully autonomous vehicle where a human is not engaged in the driving at all. They stand conservatively to reduce the number of accidents on U.S. roads by 94%. And that's because 94% of all accidents on our road are caused by human driver error. The great thing about self-driving vehicles is they can't drive drunk, they can't fall asleep, they're not going to text and drive. And they also have cameras and what's called LiDAR built into them. And so they can scan millions of points on the road every single second. So their powers of perception are so much better than ours. And so, from my perspective, this is a technology not only that's going to free up a huge amount of time, you'll be able to reclaim your commute and do other things while you're in the car, but it's going to save a tremendous amount of lives as well. And I think that's something to really keep front and center when you're thinking about driverless vehicles and how to shape law and policy around them.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's saving lives, and even for those that don't suffer a fatality, the number of injuries that are motor vehicle related, healthcare dollars, long-term care dollars, emotional trauma on families who survive this kind of car accident or trucking accident.
Right.
The costs are of driver errors is huge. Insurance costs, litigation costs.
Yeah.
The impact on our legal system with cases. My plaintiff lawyer brothers and sisters won't be happy to hear this, but those who concentrate entirely on doing auto accident cases.
Right, or people who focus exclusively on DUI cases.
Or
right?
DUI cases.
Here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so the impact just on that alone is huge, and there were some other benefits to the still not completely proven new industry of and not fully available yet, obviously, industry of driverless cars, but there are a lot of other types of benefits we could anticipate. That you talk about, for instance, those who can't drive, and I might even say shouldn't drive, elderly, those who have a disability that prohibits them from driving in a driverless vehicle. All of a sudden, the concept of independence and mobility takes on a whole new meaning.
Right.
You also talk.
Also,
go ahead.
There's huge productivity gains as well. So, there's the aspect that when you're in a self-driving vehicle, you'll be able to work if you want to, or sleep or relax. But also, self-driving cars will be able to drive much, much faster, right? Their reaction time is so much quicker than humans. And so where a lot of people in this space are thinking this will go is eventually, we'll be able to raise speed limits because these vehicles are going to be able to communicate with each other and drive much, much quicker. And so you'll be saving commute time. You'll be able to reclaim commute time. Fuel efficiency is going to increase drastically. They're not going to sort of brake and accelerate as human drivers tend to do. And so there's all those gains as well that I think are worth thinking about.
You also talk about, particularly in urban areas where a lot of space is devoted to parking your car. If you live in New York City, when I lived in New York years ago, that it was a joke, but it wasn't really funny because it was true. People were paying as much as some people paid for an apartment just to have a parking space for their car if they owned a car in the city.
Right.
And so cost and space, all the space that's taken up with parking. You can imagine in a driverless car world, fewer people would need to own a car. They could have a car pick them up and take them from place to place rather than have to own a car.
And that's actually where a lot of economists think that we're going. From an economic perspective, it's really inefficient to own a car because over 95% of the time your car is sitting idle. And so economists are projecting that we're essentially going to have fleets of driverless cars, and you'll buy a membership in one of those fleets. And so you can just summon a car to pick you up whenever you need it. And I don't do research in that space, but I tend to believe that's sort of where we're going to go with car ownership.
Well, we know that, it's interesting, too, to reflect back on the time when our country was transitioning to machines for travel like cars and trains and other things that weren't alive like horses. And the people imagined that this was scary because they were dangerous. And actually, they were proved right. The automobile has transformed American society in all kinds of ways. But as you've already pointed out, it also is a very dangerous mode of transportation. And, I like to travel, and people might say, oh, you're going to that place, isn't that kind of scary? And say, it's very easy to point out that you're much more likely to get injured on the Schuylkill Expressway, which is our local highway, or any highway or road in America, or in a parking lot, than so people were right more than 100 years ago that even though they didn't fully understand the scope of it, that cars were dangerous. What are people's worries and fears about driverless cars? We talked about some of the benefits that we could hope to realize as we move more and more into that world. What are people afraid of here?
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's a fear of loss of control, because that's exactly what it is, right? When you are in a self-driving car, you have minimal control over what that car is doing, and that's really scary, right? Particularly when you're driving 70 miles an hour down a highway. So I have a semi-autonomous car, which means that my car can steer and accelerate and brake on its own, but I have to supervise it. It's not entirely autonomous. I have to monitor what the car is doing. And I do have the ability to grab the steering wheel or hit the brake or the accelerator anytime I want to. But even in that kind of situation, which is only really a partial surrender of control, I have a lot of fear, or I did when I first started driving that kind of car. Right, it feels a lot of control. What I learned is that there's sort of an area in a lane that I like to be. Just sort of that's like my own sort of personal preference. And that's not necessarily a preference of my car. And so, it took me a little bit of time to get used to the fact that my car likes to be, more centered than I do. I apparently have a tendency to want to, drift slightly left in the lane. And so that's really scary for people, and that's scary for people in all kinds of situations. I think there's also just a lot of concern as well, and there's been a lot written about this, that terrorists are going to hack the cars and make them drive off of bridges or drive into each other. There's been some really sort of funny and kind of scary sci-fi sort of perspectives on this, like, what if you get into your car and it drives onto a boat and then you're stuck on a boat in the middle of the ocean, or, things like that. And so I think it's sort of fear of the unknown and fear of surrender and control at base.
Well, I mean, they do require more computerized technology to operate than we're used to, but probably also more computerized technology than we realize already exists. I mean, that's that.
Right.
I mean, you can't take your car to the mechanic without them running diagnostics on the computers in your car now.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I wonder if it's also, perception and lack of understanding that is the basis for a lot of the fears that we have.
I think it's too, like with my parents. So my parents recently purchased a Tesla, and I cannot convince my dad to use it. He just refuses. Like, he doesn't trust the technology, no matter how I explain it to him. Part of what he's saying is sort of exactly what you said, which is that, with the cars that he used to have, he could open up the engine and sort of understand what was happening, right? Like, okay, the alternator needs to be replaced, or, I need to change the oil. And with a driverless car, unless you're an engineer and a computer programmer, right? I mean, you're just not going to understand what it is that your car is doing with any level of nuance. I mean, I'm not going to understand what my car is doing. I don't know what the algorithms are. It's incredibly sophisticated. And I think that, too, can really scare a lot of people, right? That sense that you have surrendered control to something that you fundamentally don't understand, and that really you have no hope of understanding, right? Unless you go back to school and take on technology in a totally intense kind of way. And I think that's an issue. I think, this year we've seen some car companies really pushing back on that. So there are car companies now running advertisements about, how driverless cars are not scary. There's been one with LeBron James in it, in which he's sort of scared at first when he's driving in his car, and then by the end he's like, oh, this is great. And so I think there's a little bit of public outreach that needs to happen here, just because of that sort of complexity involved in this product.
To help shape public opinion and public views on these things. Yeah. Well, let's take
the other thing, I got to be honest,
sure.
like the other thing that I encounter a lot, I go around, all over the place talking about driverless cars, and there's a really large number of people who will come up at the end of my talk and say, I believe you that these are going to be great, but at the end of the day, I still like driving. I like the feeling of the wind in my hair. I like the act of driving, and I don't want to give that up. And I think that that's important not to sort of underestimate either.
Well, wasn't that long ago that people preferred Blackberries because they had more of the feel of pressing keys like you did on an old-fashioned phone or on an old-fashioned typewriter.
Right.
and it took time before people actually took to the iPhone because the iPhone was more touchscreen oriented. Well, BlackBerry's out of business now, or I think maybe they've reconstituted to do something. But
yeah, that was remarkably
right,
fast, wasn't it?
It was really
everybody
fast.
Had BlackBerries, but nobody had BlackBerries.
Right, and that. So I could see with any technology, and not just with technology. I mean, with changes in musical styles. I mean, it does take time, for change to happen, but change is happening. This is taking place, and maybe you need to say a few words about what we mean by a driverless car, because it does mean different things. And as I mentioned earlier, I didn't even realize I was driving right now a partially self-driving vehicle, because it has. So say a little bit about that, because I think maybe people imagine something out of the Jetsons or some other sci-fi movie where where the car lifts off into space and flies from place to places, something really far out and futuristic. But the reality is it's actually not that futuristic, and the technology isn't that far off, and in some cases is here already. So maybe say a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, so people think that this is coming out of nowhere, like you said, and that it's sort of a black or white option. Either you have a human-driven car or you have a driverless car. And that's not at all the case. This transition has been happening really since the 1960s, right? And so the federal government and people who research and write about driverless cars have developed a 5-level measurement of autonomy in cars. So a level 0 car is a car that has no autonomy whatsoever. And so a good example there would be a car that doesn't have cruise control, right? There's no way that the car can take part in any of the driving operation. A level 1 car is what most people in the United States have right now, and that's a car with cruise control. And that's a form of autonomy, right? Because it allows you to essentially take your foot off the accelerator and cede that control over to the car itself. Now, you can retake control anytime you want, but for a moment or for some period of time, the car has taken control of one aspect of what we call the driving task, right? That's the acceleration and decelerating part of driving.
And you can decide not to use it, too, in the first place. I mean, I've cruise control in my car. I never use it because I just don't like it.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of people don't, right? So, or, you only use it on long car rides, right? So fundamentally, the human is deciding how, when and how to use the cruise control, to use it a lot, to use it sometimes, to use it not at all. Level 2 cars are also now currently available to consumers and on U.S. roads. And I think the last I counted, or last I looked, there's probably around 300 to 400,000 of them. And those are what we call semi-autonomous cars. So the most famous example of this, Tesla was in the lead with this technology when they released their Model S with autopilot. There are other companies now, like Cadillac has Super Cruise. There's a lot of different companies. They all have systems that are named something different. But a level 2 car will allow you to cede more than one control over to the car. So, for instance, in a Tesla with autopilot, you can hand over braking, accelerating, and steering to the car. So you can take your hands off the wheel and your feet off the pedals, and let the car sort of do that basic driving task for you. Similarly, things like electronic stability control and lane centering are considered level 2 technologies because you could use them and cruise control at the same time. Level 2 cars work differently depending on what kind of car that you're driving, but the idea is that you could have both your hands and your feet off the pedals, and the car will be able to drive. Now, critically, it's a semi-autonomous vehicle. In all level 2 vehicles, you have to supervise your vehicle at all times as the driver. They're not capable yet of driving safely entirely on their own, and that's really a legal issue that we haven't gotten a handle on yet. From there on out, there are level 4 and level 5 cars, and those are what we would call driverless cars. Those are cars in which you can, essentially move into the back seat and let the car do the driving entirely on its own. And in fact, in level 4 and 5 vehicles, the human driver may not have an option to intervene, right? So Google, now Waymo, is developing level 4 and 5 vehicles that don't have a steering wheel and don't have pedals. And so you don't even have the option of intervening if you wanted to. In the middle are what are called level 3 vehicles. And those are a little bit confusing because they're not quite level 2. They're more advanced, but they're not quite level 4 or 5 yet. And so those are vehicles where presumably you could let them drive on their own. You wouldn't have to supervise 100% of the time, but the vehicle might have to signal to you at some point, I'm approaching a construction area. I need you to get back into control of the vehicle. I need you to drive now. And those are not available, although Tesla has said that their Model S's will be at a level 3 by the end of this year. I'm not sure if they're going to hit that, but that's what they're saying.
So, okay. So, to what extent then are these type of vehicles, or I guess, what are the projections for when we're going to see more and more truly driverless cars?
Yeah, so that's the $10 million question. I've noticed that about once every 6 to 8 weeks, some major news publication I writes what I call a hatchet job on driverless cars. So, once every 6 to 8 weeks, there's some article in like the Wall Street Journal saying, oh, what about this problem? Developers haven't considered this problem. We're not going to have driverless cars for another 20 years. So we see that every 6 to 8 weeks. From my perspective, I think that we've actually exceeded sort of the timeline that we've set for ourselves with driverless cars. And so I think realistically, fully driverless cars are probably somewhere 5 to 10 years away. I think that level 3 cars are coming really soon. I think more likely they'll be here within the next 1 to 3 years. But fully driverless, I think, are a little bit longer away. I don't believe the projections that they're 20 years away, but they may be 7 or 8 years away.
So this is coming, and it's not just Tesla. It's all the car companies, right? And not just car companies. Right. The big, Google has been working on driverless cars for years. Right. So this isn't just Ford, Chrysler, and Chevy. This is
right. This is everybody.
This is happening.
The major difference, I'll say, though, is there's two approaches being taken right now. And so I've termed these the gradualist approach and the all-in approach. So a lot of the tech companies, Google's company is called Waymo. What they've determined is they don't think that they can develop a car in which the human and the car sort of change roles back and forth and be able to do that safely. So Waymo has said, we don't think we can develop a safe level 3 car. We don't know how to design a car in which a human has to retake control and can do so safely and in an ample amount of time. So companies like Waymo have said, we're not going to release a car until we have a level 4 or 5 vehicle that's safer than any human-driven car on the road. More conventional car companies are taking what I call a gradualist approach. And so Tesla's a good example here. Tesla released a level 2 car, 3 years ago. And then over time, their car is slowly evolving to be more and more autonomous. So their cars are going to be level 3, and then they'll be level 4, and they'll be level 5. And other sort of traditional car manufacturers are doing that as well. And what they're saying is look, we just don't think we're going to be able to sell a level 4 car to a consumer unless that consumer is comfortable with some level of autonomy. And so it's going to be interesting to see, how those two approaches play out. I'm sort of with the tech companies. I don't know if you can develop a safe level 3 vehicle. I think it might make sense to wait till we have a level 4 or level 5 vehicle. But I do understand what the traditional car companies are saying in terms of getting, consumer acceptance on, or getting consumers on board with this product.
Well, let's get into the law of all of this because first of all, as you said, there's a wide space, and you're in that space, but you'd like some company to help figure out how we're going to deal with all this legally and extra legally. And we could talk on and on about the pros and cons, and we've mentioned some of the benefits. There are people talking about or worrying about some of the potential problems, not just people who worry about hacking their way onto some boat in the middle of the ocean, but we do have over 1 million people in this country whose livelihood depends on working as a truck driver. And if we have driverless trucks, which is one of the applications I know we may see before other wide applications of driverless vehicles, you're going to have to figure out what are those people going to, what's going to be their transition economically. But this isn't really an economics podcast or one where we can wax on about the role of the vehicle in American culture over the last 100+ years either. But we do talk about the law, and there just seems to be so many questions raised by this now transforming new technology that is much, much further along than I realize, and I'm sure that many people realize. We have a tort system in this country that is built on the idea that we can insure for situations where one citizen is wronged by another, and the classic two-car collision in the middle of an intersection is always a great illustration of that. That's right. Why in a lot of states you can't have, you can't drive a car unless you have a certain minimum amount of liability insurance to drive that car. So in a driverless world, assuming the technology works as promised, and indeed gets better and better and better over time as it's designed to do. And if you're right, that eliminates 94% of car accidents, which are tied to human error, you're left with product defect type cases or malfunction type cases. So how does the law deal with all of that?
Yeah, that's the critical question that we're grappling with in this space. Inevitably, there will be driverless car crashes. There have been driverless car crashes already, and the ones that are being tested. And how do we go about thinking about liability when we may not have human involvement at all, right? It's really easy to say, well, we sue the designer, or we sue the computer programmer. But, a lot of these cars, all of these cars have machine learning built into them, where over time, the car, adapts its own algorithms based on the type of driving that it's doing. So how do we begin to think about liability when we've taken humans out of the equation? And that's a central question, not just with driverless cars, but with all kinds of new technologies that are, emerging in our marketplace. And my sort of fear in this space is that we're going to apply, older models of liability. We're going to apply precedent coming from car crashes involving two human drivers to these cars. Because I think if we get the law wrong and we get the lawsuits wrong, we risk really toppling this technology before consumers have really had a chance to adopt it in any large number. So I don't know what the answer to that question is yet. There's lots of different ideas out there right now about how we should grapple and treat liability in these situations. One thing that I have proposed in my own writing is actually taking these kinds of cases out of the tort system entirely and putting them into, for example, like a victim compensation fund kind of structure, where, you pay a tax on every vehicle purchased with driverless technology, and if there's an accident of some sort, you can petition the fund rather than going through the tort system. And, there are all kinds of incentives that you have to build into that. If car companies want to participate in this fund, they're going to have to, provide data to the government, adapt their technologies when we identify a safety issue. But I'm not sure yet what the right answer is, although I think, like I said, it may involve for at least some period of time taking these cases out of the traditional judicial system while we figure out how to adapt our paradigms for liability for these new technologies.
Well, right, and I guess that's the question. And I don't do a lot of auto cases in my practice, but I do a lot of tort cases, and the concept that litigation over wrongful conduct can lead to improvements in safety, whether it's in hospitals or, the famous Ford Pinto case, and others like it. It's a belief I hold very strongly. So, the concept of a victim's compensation fund, which doesn't exist very widely in our society. I mean, you do see that with vaccines. I mean, we've made right. That's one example where we've taken those cases where someone's injured through a vaccine, and there's a small percentage of those who will, though the vast majority won't be. We carve that out of the court system and create a way for people to be compensated, but not through traditional litigation. And 9/11, the people who were injured after the 9/11 terrorist attack, there was a compensation. And there have been other situations like that, but generally we don't use those types of vehicles. It's hard to avoid puns when we're having this conversation, but we don't usually have those types of vehicles for handling situations when things go wrong. What's your concern about keeping things in? What is your concern about inhibiting the progress of the technology because of litigation?
I think my concern is that there is some level of risk that's going to be involved in the use of driverless cars, right? Like, there is going to be some number of accidents every year when we make this transition. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad product, right? Or that we should go back to human-driven cars. And that's why I think vaccines are a good analogy, right? I am a believer in vaccines. Vaccines are incredibly important from a public health perspective. But we know that vaccines are going to cause some small number of injuries every year, right? It's unavoidable. And that doesn't mean that vaccines are bad, right? It just means that there is a predictable rate of injury associated with them, and that can't really be overcome, right? We've sort of done as much as we can do to make vaccines safe, but unfortunately, some number of children are going to be injured a year. That's exactly what's going to be true for driverless cars, right? We're never going to have a 0% accident rate. And critically, I don't think that means that something has gone wrong. I think it's just that there's risk inherent in the system. And so my concern is that particularly at first, when we have these vehicles on the road and consumers are still incredibly skeptical about how safe they are and whether they're as good as human-driven cars, that, just a small handful of accidents could completely derail the industry, right? It could result in, incredibly high jury verdicts. It could result in really unfavorable precedent for driverless cars. And if that's the case, it could sink the industry. And given that, I think, that driverless cars are going to save lives, that's going to have really devastating consequences from a public health standpoint. And the exact same thing happened with vaccines, right? In the 1980s, people were suing vaccine manufacturers in large numbers. We almost had a shortage of childhood vaccines around 1984, 1985 because people stopped manufacturing them. It wasn't worth the liability exposure. And so that's why the government stepped in and said, look, we're going to create a victim compensation fund to deal with this sort of issue. What we have to grapple with as a society is how much risk we're comfortable with driverless cars, right? Given that it's not going to be zero. And already, like I said, we've seen a small handful of accidents whenever, driverless vehicles are tested. And the response is always the same, right? People are horrified. People are like, well, that just goes to show that, they're never going to be as good as a human-driven car. And that response really concerns me, and it concerns me long term.
Well, see, I'm not sure what I think, but I'm pushed back a little bit because I'm thinking of other analogies. I mean, there are limits in what you can. There are limits in what a citizen can do when injured by a nuclear reactor in this country.
Right.
There's federal law on that, and as a matter of social policy or energy policy or national security policy, the law, coming in the form of federal statutes, coming in the form of judicial decisions interpreting those laws, and Congress amending, the law through the many ways the law is created and evolves has decided or is based on certain decisions that we need to protect that industry because of its importance to our country in a variety of ways, just as I think we've made that decision when it comes to vaccines. But, going back to the analogy you've started us with, which was the transition from horses to automobiles. And by the way, we've so far only touched on one of three different types of law responses that you talk about. I mean, you could also talk about a law that would ban we mentioned this very, very briefly, but you can have a law passed to ban a particularly dangerous product. You actually mentioned lawn darts. And I remember as a kid when lawn darts were a thing until they were not a thing because they got banned because they were so dangerous.
And rightly so.
And rightly so. I remember throwing one around in our front yard as a kid. And then a second category you talk about are time, place, and manner type restrictions where you're not banning the product, but you're limiting its use in some way. You might allow driverless vehicles, for example, differently in a city than on a highway. Just, give one simple example. And there could be those kinds of responses to law. And then there can be what we've been talking about, which is litigation, when something goes wrong and someone has a tort claim or a civil claim, that typically gets handled in court.
Right.
So going back to the transition from horses to cars, there were a lot of people worried that cars would be dangerous, and probably long before it could even be imagined all the ways in which cars transformed our society and have probably been proven instrumental in our economic development, over the course of the 20th century. And yet we did not take car accidents out of the court system. So why do you see this as something different?
I think it's different because I think for the first time in history, we're seeing the potential of a large number of cases that don't involve a human decision at all. There's this quote that I love from a book called Robots Are People Too, in which the author says that the entire history of human laws has assumed that at some point a human has made a decision, right? Like that's a foundational part of tort law. And I think that with driverless cars, we will reach a point with that technology, along with other types of technologies, like I said, drones, things like that, in which it's going to be really hard to pinpoint some sort of faulty human decision anywhere in the chain of events. And I think what that could mean for victims is that there's no recovery to be had at all. And that doesn't sit well with me as a torts professor, right? I think that if you're injured by a product, in a lot of cases, you'll be able to recover something to deal with your injuries. And so, I'm not saying that we should take these out of the court system entirely, but I do think we're in this kind of hinky situation right now where we haven't developed, statutory or common law in and around driverless vehicles. And just a few bad statutes or a few bad rulings could really be enough to really stymie the industry. And so in this interim period, I think that a victim compensation fund may make sense. Over time, that may no longer be true. Our court system and our statutory laws are going to have to adapt to all kinds of new technologies. And when we get more comfortable with that, my hope is that we'll have a body of law that makes sense with these products, but we don't have one now. And that includes, for instance, cruise control cases. The way that I got involved in this area of law at all was that I just happened upon a case involving cruise control. So this is a case from 1970-something, 1975, 76 out of New Jersey, where somebody got into their vehicle, they set their cruise control, and then, according to them, the cruise control malfunctioned, the vehicle accelerated very suddenly, and it plowed into a tree. And it injured somebody in the process. It injured a pedestrian. And that was their defense when the pedestrian sued. And the court did not know how to handle that case. And so what the judge wound up saying was, well, your decision to use a car with cruise control at all was the negligent decision, or essentially a decision for which you are responsible for anything that results. and found that person liable. Now, it's entirely possible that their story was false, that it was an excuse, that they screwed up driving somehow. But if what they said is true, that's a really troubling decision, right? Because the precedent now in that state is that just the mere act of choosing to drive a vehicle with some level of autonomy, that alone can be the basis of liability. And that should concern all of us.
And important to any compensation fund scheme, other than the compensation part of it, is building into that ways to keep companies incentivized, you mentioned this earlier, to not create shortcuts in manufacturing and design just to save money at the expense of safety. So, I mean, can you say a little bit about, I know this is all very in the early stages of thinking through, but how would you do that? Or can you say a few words about that?
So we actually have two major problems right now in this industry. Well, I would say three, but the two that are relevant for our purposes. Right now, the federal government wants to regulate driverless cars. It is trying to regulate driverless cars, but it really has a lack of information, right? It can't compel companies to hand over all of the data about their cars, all of the safety data. There's no mechanism to do that with regard to autonomous technologies. And what that means is that NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, Traffic Safety Administration, can't get the information that it needs to make the decisions it needs from a regulatory perspective. So one thing that we need to incentivize companies to do is to share their data with the federal government so that we can then, in response, regulate in some way to ensure that these vehicles are safe. The second problem that we have is we really have no mechanism right now to force companies or compel companies to change problematic aspects of their autonomous system. So this is really kind of scary if you think about it. But if a car manufacturer right now wants to release a level 3 vehicle onto the market, there's absolutely nothing stopping them from doing so. And critically, there's going to be no oversight from any governmental body, right? They're going to have to submit safety data with regard to their seatbelts and their airbags, and they're going to have to meet other federal vehicle safety requirements. But we don't have those yet for autonomous systems. And that's a real problem, right? We can't identify the problems in these vehicles, and we can't force manufacturers to change them if we could. And so in the model that I proposed for a victim compensation fund, if companies wanted to participate and be protected from liability, they would have to do both of those things. They would have to share much more data with the federal government, but also agree to be regulated and to change their autonomous systems to the extent that it's warranted, for safety reasons.
Some people are maybe concerned about the idea of expanding government, particularly federal government regulation. It sounds like it would be pretty hard for this type of system that you're talking about to be run on a state-by-state basis, because the way to assure a commitment to safety, as you're describing it, is you have to have access to the data. And how could you do that if you had to do it 50 different ways in 50 different states? I mean, so it seems like it almost has to be a federal system from what you're describing.
Yeah, and in fact, it's been really interesting. The car manufacturers have actually asked repeatedly the federal government to step in and regulate, because states already have started passing laws about driverless vehicles. Over half of the states now have passed legislation about these level 4 and 5 vehicles that don't exist yet, right, or don't exist to consumers yet. And we're seeing exactly what you described. We're seeing this sort of patchwork of regulations, all of which say something different, and it's driving the car manufacturing industry crazy, and understandably so. And so this is a sort of a unique situation in that industry has been asking for centralized regulation for a long time.
Well, Tracy, the subtitle of your article, which I mentioned at the top of the program, is "The Role of Law in the Coming Extinction of Human-Driven Vehicles." It sounds like you're already there. It sounds like you think you're not putting a question mark after that. You're making that a statement.
Yeah.
And it does seem like the technology is so much further along than most of us. You're an exception, I think, but most of us even imagined was true. If people want to learn more and maybe read more, maybe even get a copy of this article, what's the best way for people to follow up?
Sure. So you can just Google Hands Off the Wheel, the coming extinction of human-driven cars, and it will link you to my SSRN page, which has all of my driverless car papers for download. You're also always free to email me at tracy.pearl@ttu.edu, and I'm on Twitter at Prof. Tracy Pearl. And I love talking about this topic, so please feel free to reach out if you have questions.
And and everyone listening should certainly get this article. It's a really great overview of the whole issue, and covers a lot of the ground in more detail than we were able to in this episode. But I love talking about this topic too, and as I mentioned, Tracy, I've been really looking forward to talking with you about this. It's kind of amazing to me that we're not talking about it more, actually. So I thank you for helping us at least get up to 2019 on the state of all of this. And we have a long, long way to go. But Tracy Pearl, thank you so much. Law professor at Texas Tech University Law School and author of Hands Off the Wheel. I think if you Google Hands Off the Wheel, you'll find the article, and it's well worth the read. Tracy, thanks again for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
This was great fun. Thank you so much.